Welcome back, everyone, to Intermediate Macroeconomics. I'm your professor, Dr. Matthew Bradbury. We're going to continue with our classical model, building the labor market. And we're going to start with labor demand, and we'll move into labor supply and looking at labor market equilibrium and its determination of the equilibrium level of labor, which, of course, we can then plug into the production function to derive the equilibrium level of output. Let's take a little refresher of our last lecture. Here what we have is the production function, and so output is on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have labor. So we're doing a short-run analysis here, and what we've done is vary the amount of labor relative to fixed capital and fixed technology, and what we see is that we see an increase in output at a decreasing rate. This is known as diminishing marginal returns, or the diminishing marginal returns to labor. Now, we were thinking about the marginal product of labor, which is the productivity of labor, right? The contribution to additional output from adding one additional unit of labor. And we saw that the marginal product of labor, right, the incremental output derived from an additional laborer, is the slope of the production function. And because this production function has a bowed slope, we know that the marginal product of labor will be changing. Particularly, we'll start off with a high marginal product of labor. Initial workers will contribute a lot of output to the productive process. But as capital gets scarce and we add more and more and more and more workers to share that capital, the productivity of workers will decline. So the marginal product will increase right at the beginning, and it will continue increasing output, but the marginal product itself will be falling throughout the entire exercise. So marginal product starts out high and gets smaller and smaller and smaller as the slope gets less and less and less steep. So we kind of have an understanding here about what workers contribute to output, which then can be, of course, sold for revenue. And what these workers are contributing to output is this marginal product of labor. What every additional worker contributes to output is their marginal product of labor. We can use this relationship to start to understand the demand for labor, right? So the output, right, produced by each worker, right, is the value of hiring that worker to the firm. So our marginal product of labor represents the value that workers produce for a firm in real terms. That output is measured in terms of real output, or Y, right? But when it's sold to become revenue, it usually has a price attached to it, right? So marginal product might be you produced 3 cups of coffee. But the value of that marginal product determines revenue for the firm, or the benefit of having that worker in the office. And so the nominal value that the worker produces is the real output, marginal product of labor, multiplied by the price level. This is also called the value marginal product of labor, right? It's the value of the marginal product. It's a nominal sum, right? If you had 2 cups of coffee selling for $1 a piece, then the value of the marginal product would be $2. If you had 2 cups of coffee that were selling for $4 a piece, the value of the marginal product would be $8. So now we have a numerical value in nominal and in real terms of hiring the worker. The nominal marginal cost of hiring a worker is the wage, right? You have to hire a wage to get them to work to produce marginal product that then can be sold at price P. So from our general profit maximization requirement in microeconomics and in other areas of macroeconomics, you may remember that optimization, whether it's utility optimization or profit maximization, requires a firm to follow the following rule. Hire up until the point that the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. And so that's a generalized rule, right? And this is a profit maximization criteria. So if the firm is maximizing profit, then it must hire up to the point where the marginal product of hiring is equal to the marginal cost. All right, well, what does this look like? We've got our marginal benefit and we've got our marginal cost. Our marginal benefit in nominal terms is the marginal product of labor multiplied by P, and our marginal cost in nominal terms is the nominal wage, W. This is an equilibrium condition, right? This is a condition that shows the hiring level where firms have maximized profit. So If they're maximizing profit, they must be following this rule. We can express this rule in real terms rather than in nominal terms, and by doing so, we just divide by P. Now what we have is the real marginal product of labor, or the number of units produced, is equal to the purchasing power of the real wage, or the wage in terms of commodities that it can buy. W over P is the real wage. It's the amount of the wage in terms of goods and services that it can purchase. And of course, marginal product of labor is a real variable as well. It's the number of units of output that we've produced. So we've got this equilibrium demand for labor expressed to you in nominal terms, right? Value marginal product of labor is equal to the nominal wage, and also in real terms, the marginal product of labor is equal to the real wage. What we essentially have here is a rule governing, right, how much firms will hire at different wage rates. And so ND will stand for labor demand, and this is firms' demand for workers, will be equal to some mathematical function. We'll just use G to establish that function since F was used for our production function. Some mathematical function G, and the important variable that determines labor demand inside that function is the real wage. Now I want to digress for just one moment, because this statement of labor demand, this profit maximizing statement, is actually a theory of income distribution, right? So if we look at either our nominal expression of labor demand or our real expression of labor demand, let's take nominal for instance, we can see why workers get paid what they get paid, right? In equilibrium, right, the remuneration to workers, right, should be equal to the value of what they produce, right? So this statement says you're not paying workers more than what they contribute to production. You're not paying workers less than what they contribute to production. You're paying workers exactly what they contribute to production. So this is a statement about income distribution in society. And you'll note that this argument that workers are paid equal to the value of what they produce is a consequence of firms selfishly maximizing profit, right? So if firms are selfishly maximizing profit, then workers get paid according to the value of what they produce. It's a statement about income distribution, and it's a statement that says whatever income distribution is, it's quote unquote fair and just because workers are paid equivalent to what they produce, right? They take whatever they give in some sense, right? Their command over output, their ability to purchase output, will be equivalent to the value of the output that they themselves have contributed to society. So it makes the system appear to be fair, appear to be just, and appear to be based off of meritocracy. So if you're looking at your nominal wage W, and we want to understand how can you increase your nominal wage, there are two answers. You can either increase your productivity, become more effective at producing more real output, or you can increase the value of what you produce by increasing the price of what you produce. Maybe you produce something that is rare. Maybe you produce something that is exceptionally difficult to find or exceptionally regarded in high value for society, in which case it'll sell for a higher price. So this is a theory not only of income distribution, but a statement about the system being a meritocracy, that in equilibrium, even under the selfish, ruthless profit maximization of firms, workers will get paid according to their productivity and the value of the output that they produce. So if you want to make more money, you become either more productive or you produce something that society values at a higher price. So this is one theory of income distribution. There are other theories of income distribution, but this is the theory of income distribution that essentially states, here's an economic theory that brings about harmony and peace in society. So if you have haves and have-nots, wealthy and poor, how do you convince them that that distribution of income is acceptable? And this statement of income distribution is striving to do exactly that. It says, look, there might be differences in income, but those differences are based off of different merits, right? And so the wealthy deserve their wealth because they've earned it, and the poor then deserve their poverty because, in essence, they've earned it, right? So this is a statement about the existing distribution of income being justified. And I want you to keep that in mind because, again, it's this connection between theory, policy, theory and ideology, theory and society. Now we have a similar expression as this regarding capital. We just have the value marginal product of capital would be equal to not the wage, because that's paid to workers, but the profit level or whatever is remunerated to owners of capital. Right? Let's continue to build our labor demand curve. This is a representation of the marginal product of labor schedule for some representative firm. We saw that we have labor inputs here, and that initially, as we apply initial levels of labor to the production function, we have a very high marginal product. As we continue hiring more workers, the slope of the production function gets flatter, and the marginal product of labor begins to fall. Additional workers are able to produce at lower marginal products of labor. And so we should have here a downward sloping marginal product of labor curve. How can that marginal product of labor curve shift? Well, one of the things is if we added more capital, workers across the board would have more capital to work with, and it would increase their productivity. So a shift in the marginal product of labor in an upward direction might stem from accumulation of additional capital or anything else that might increase the productivity of workers. Such as an increase in A, right? So the production function had A, which was total factor productivity, and an effect of increasing total factor productivity would have a similar shift, right? The marginal product of labor curve would shift up or shift out, representing higher productivity at each unit of labor. Well, this marginal product of labor curve essentially becomes the labor demand curve. The marginal product of labor curve shows the marginal benefit of hiring workers over different ranges of labor, right? The marginal product of labor curve and the labor demand curve, well, they're kind of the same thing. They're derived from the same source, which is the falling marginal product of labor. The labor demand curve shows a relationship between the real wage, we can also have it be the nominal wage, and the quantity of labor demanded. It's really the same as the marginal product of labor curve, since optimal hiring occurs where the real wage is equal to the marginal product of labor curve. So the labor demand curve will be downward sloping. Firms want to hire less labor the higher the real wage. This is because they need to have a higher marginal product of labor. And as the wage declines, the firm can afford to hire more workers at lower marginal products of labor. This diagram illustrates that relationship, right? At a very, very high real wage, in order to keep the equilibrium, the real wage is equal to the marginal product of labor, we hire up to a point where we have a very high marginal product of labor, which occurs at low quantities of labor demanded. As the real wage declines, we can hire more workers at lower marginal products of labor. So we have an inverse relationship between the independent variable here, which is the real wage, and the dependent variable here, which is the quantity of labor demanded. As the real wage goes down, the quantity of labor demanded goes up. It's a negative relationship or an inverse relationship. As the real wage increases, well, the quantity demanded of labor declines. So movements in the real wage will represent movements along our downward sloping labor demand curve. Real wage goes down, we move along the labor demand curve, hiring more and more workers, and so forth. There are also factors that will shift the labor demand curve, and you'll note that it was also anything that shifted the marginal product of labor curve. So once you know one of those, you pretty much know both of them, right? What were some of the factors that can shift the labor demand curve? Well, a change in the wage could cause a movement along the labor demand curve, not a shift in the curve. But supply shocks, right, might shift the curve. A beneficial supply shock, raising productivity of workers, would shift up the marginal product of labor, and either cause workers to be paid more or cause more workers to be hired. As the capital stock grows, we might see the marginal product of labor shift up, representing higher worker productivity, and we'd either see workers getting paid more or more workers being hired. We've also got, technology, which we could include in the supply shock there, right? A beneficial boost to total factor productivity would shift the labor demand curve up or out, however you want to view it, and workers would either be paid more or more workers would be hired. So there you've got the basics of it, right? The labor demand curve is rooted in the physics of production. It's rooted in the diminishing marginal returns to labor. The labor demand curve is built out of the downward sloping marginal product of labor curve. And when we throw the wage on the y-axis, we then convert the marginal product of labor curve into a labor demand curve, showing that there is an inverse relationship between the real wage and the demand for labor. We can also represent the labor demand curve in nominal terms by having the nominal wage on the y-axis and the quantity of labor on the x-axis. And if we do that, we simply have to account for the price level. So we'll put it in the curve itself, modeling the value marginal product of labor as the downward sloping curve, rather than simply the marginal product of labor. And we'll show you some examples of this in the future. For now, I just want you to know the origins of the labor demand curve, the profit maximizing logic as to how we derive the labor demand curve, right? The wage is equal to the marginal product of labor, and the behavior of the labor demand curve. What causes movements along the curve? Changes in the wage. And what causes shifts in the curve? Well, real supply shocks at this point. Okay, that is our labor demand curve. Feel free to shoot me any questions or review the lecture as necessary, and we'll be moving forward to discuss labor supply and then labor market dynamics as it reaches equilibrium. Have a lovely day.